Okay, Kate, let's start with you. I mean, I understand part of this. I know that rules give us a sense of structure. They give us balance and authority, and they also absolve us from doing a lot of thinking and from challenging. But rules also put us in our place. Where does this conversation take you?
Yeah, I think you laid it out so nicely in that essay to start, Howard, because the way that I think about rules and for a long time I kind of thought about rules as like they didn't come necessarily from people per se, therefore they could have biases, right? They were rules. Like they were written things and I like use the word immutable. And then, the especially playing women's sports, you start to kind of like arch an eyebrow at the way rules come about and come into play. And I started to kind of land in this place where I'm like, rules are both a reflection of society and they reinforce society at that certain time that they are made. And I think zooming out to like the historical viewpoint, as you alluded to in the piece, is a great place to start, because you even mentioned, like women's basketball, there was a time when you couldn't cross half court. If you go back even farther to just the first few years after Naismith invents the game, the way that basketball was played in many places when women played it was that as many women were on the court, there were boxes for those women. So if you had a game with
That's right.
11 players, you had 11 boxes on the court and you couldn't leave that box.
Can I stop you right there for just a quick second, Kate? Because I remember this when I was a kid, and I'm not that old, but I remember those structures. Like when you looked at the old basketball books, you saw like they had the section for the women's game, and you could see these spaces where you couldn't move. It was like you were playing Foursquare. But here's something
Yeah.
that I don't know. What was the rationale for that?
Well,
These
it's
women
the
in their
age old.
places.
Yeah, well, literally put them in their places, but like the age old rationale that permeates so much of the rules and regulations in women's sports, which is let us make this less rigorous for women. It can't possibly be that women could run even half of a court's length.
Hmm.
And we don't want to getting too physical, because when women were first starting to play basketball in that like squishy period when Naismith publishes the rules and Clara Bayer and Sanda Berenson haven't like modified them to women's rules, of course, there are women who are getting physical in trying to take the ball from one another, and we couldn't have that. So it was like both this like rigorous and this physicality to make it quote unquote ladylike. And I think even using that as an example of we should always be looking at the rules of our game as in a historical context of at the moment they're created, they are reflecting and reinforcing society, and they exist at that time based on the evolution of where both humanity is and the human body is. And I've thought about that as someone who played women's basketball. Of course, I think about the rules that exist in that all the time, and then also as someone who covered the NBA, feeling like there are some parts of this game that shouldn't be rigid anymore. That shouldn't be, as you said, Howard, immutable. Like we have evolved in so many ways, and like we need our rules to be evolving in real time.
I mean,
Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking about what you're saying there, Kate, and I know in Islam, obviously, there is this concept of polygamy that a man may have up to four wives. Well, the reason why it's four is that before, Islam, the local tribesmen in the Arabian Peninsula routinely had 15, 20, 25 wives. And so when they came in and were spreading the faith, legend has it they were like they want to get it down to monogamous, and like, boss, I don't think they're gonna go for that one. So this is
it's
like
a
a middle,
it's a
like,
compromise.
yeah, I was like, all right, can we get them down to four? Can we get it down to four? Does that work? And they're like, all right, but but
Well, that's a
otherwise they
big
were.
win if you can go from 15 to 25 down to 4. That's a big W.
Yeah.
But the idea was that at that time in history, the idea of telling these people you were going to have struggle getting converts. Well, obviously, society's progressed since then, and we've that even in of itself of four wives is an outdated concept. Similarly, in basketball, the other thing I was thinking about, not just things that were reflective of society at the time but don't reflect us now, but the concept of rules that were enacted with the belief that this would be the right thing to do to fix whatever problem. And then later on, we discovered, yeah, that absolutely didn't fix it. It might have made it worse. So in society, the great example of this is the was it the 19th Amendment? Prohibition, right? The idea that, hey, alcohol is bad. We've got all this organized crime and people are kind of late to work, whatever. We should ban alcohol. You ban it, and instead it proliferates this black market and increases violent crime as these organized crime factions are, in essence, battling for territory and for
Not
the
a
rights.
temperance man.
Yeah. And so what we end up doing is like, yeah, that we wanted it to accomplish something. It did the exact opposite. Get rid of that rule. In basketball, an example of this would be the 3-point line. Hey, 3-point shooting isn't that great. We should move it in closer. Just make it a uniform 22 feet. And they moved it in, and what happened was the people who were great shooters continue to be great shooters. But then it just, rather than get better 3-point shooting across the board, what we got were people who aren't 3-point shooters, like Charles Oakley, saying, I'll throw my hat in that ring.
Or Charles
And-
Barkley,
Close,
who
I
was
can do that.
Barkley
Yeah.
was a leading 3-point shooter in the
Mhm.
mid-90s. He was taking as many threes as anybody.
Because it's like, oh, this, now you've made it this close. Oh, yeah, all day long. And again, so we found, that probably wasn't the way to go, and we pulled it back. And so I like the idea of rules that represent society and how we think of things at the time, but also like the idea of like sometimes they're used to address things, and we figure out this doesn't work, so let's change it.
Yeah, indeed. And one of the things that's interesting about the entire conversation about rules is the reason for their enactment in the first place. And I think that what we do is we go into this believing in a certain level of fairness, that we go into it ideally, that the reason is always to create fairness. That's the reason for the rule, right? Well, sometimes the reason is control. Sometimes the reason is money. Sometimes the reason is reinforcement. You were talking about the 3-point shot in the NBA, and I thought where you were going to go was the original was back in '79. The NBA stayed away from everything that the ABA was doing because the ABA was the street league. It was the ghetto league. It wasn't the cool league, right? It wasn't the reputable league.
Yes. The idea was that this isn't basketball. This is whatever those people do over there. And this is basketball. And by the way, that belief system, even as when we sit here today, you watch NBA basketball today, and you can watch ABA basketball and NBA basketball pre-merger and say, which one of these looks more familiar?
It's the ABA.
Everyone would choose ABA. But to this day, that vein of like, yeah, that's not real exists. It's the reason why Larry Brown has 1,000 wins as opposed to 1,300 wins, as he should be the third or fourth winningest coach of all time, because they don't count ABA records, because there's this always feeling of the establishment saying that was just a sham. It was just a mockery of the game. Even as today, all the best parts, a slam dunk contest, a 3-point line on the floor, an improvisational freewheeling style of play. It's all our league now, but lacking a less.
Yeah, it's this idea that the rules are first believing that they're fair and right is kind of the default setting that we sometimes go into sports with, rather than actually realizing, to Howard, to your point that you also said in the essay, that hey, often the rules are created by the winner, in the same way that history is written by the conquerors. Rules are created by the winner. I mean, like, this is a silly example, but if you've ever played like a game at someone's house, like something stupid like charades, and at first you're
House
like,
rules?
you're making it up as you go along, right? You're like, can you skip ones? And first you're like, sure, you can skip them. Then somebody skips 9, and you're like, well, that's not working for me. You can only skip 1, and then you'll be like, and then you get to the point where the house rules, right? Like, if somebody is good at something and it's in their house, then the rules are structured so that they are maximizing their own potential. And the fact that we would believe that this wouldn't happen in sports, like the easy, case for basketball being like, once 3-point shooting is proliferated, like, we are going to make sure that we structure the rules so that hand checking's not happening, because this is the style of play that the winners are playing right now. And we have to make sure that the style that is selling, that we are getting higher ratings than we've ever gotten. Like, we don't want that 90s basketball to come creeping back in.
No,
it's like
we
the winners
don't.
writing those rules, right?
Oh, I feel
I
like a
didn't know.
winner
Yeah.
because I don't want
Yeah.
the 90s to come back. Final score: Pacers 69, Knicks 62.
In
Right.
48
overtime.
minutes.
But like
In overtime.
this thing of like the rules being fair and right, like there's always a finite time where they're working. Whether they're fair, we'll leave that aside. But whether they're working, it's always a moving target.
Yeah.
We don't put rules in and then 40 years later that it's a rare rule unless it's a foundational piece of a game that is still working. And to me the interesting thing about football, because it's the jumping off point, is the NFL games. It might just be for NFL overtime that there's no perfect way of doing it.
No,
I mean,
that's
we've
right.
been living that way for a very long time with soccer. Like when we get to penalty kicks,
Yeah.
like we're all sitting there going, God, there's got to be a better way. But maybe there isn't. And that when we get to that point in a game, that's when you're kind of like, ooh, well, sports aren't just black and white. And we have always created everything to the very last second to be the most fair. Sometimes you get there and you're like, we ain't got nothing better than this.
Exactly. Well, we're going to get back to that in a quick second, but I want to stop right now and just say, in terms of house rules, yes, when you play Monopoly, the utility money goes under free parking.
Free parking. Yep.
Right? It does, doesn't it?
All the
fines go under free
everything.
parking.
Yes, absolutely.
I remember playing that once, and I put the money into free parking, and some people I was playing with, they're like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "I'm putting the money where it's supposed to go."
Yeah.
Everybody knows this. House rules.
House
Middle
rules.
board.
Right.
House
And I
rules.
think that one of the things too, and we're talking about fairness, you can't get away. It's almost like what we've been talking about the last 2 weeks previously about this illusion of meritocracy. We have this illusion of fairness. And when I think about this, I think about baseball. The rules that we watch, and it's not the baseball rules as much as it is the baseball unwritten rules. All of that comes from the pre-integration game. Baseball is played very differently across the world. You watch the way during the pandemic, and we were watching Korean baseball, and you're seeing all the bat flips, and they play the game. They swing differently. They play differently. It's a very different style over there. You watch a Caribbean baseball. You go watch the Dominican Winter League baseball. They play with a different energy. You watch Negro League baseball, different energy. But then when you come to the big leagues, Major League Baseball, white American baseball, now we're going to hit you in the head if you hit a home run off of us, right? The next guy goes down. Like, there's a totally different unwritten rule structure that baseball has been struggling with for the last 40 years about whether or not how this game is played. Is it playing the game right, or is this simply the way you play the game?
Right. Is it just, yep, go ahead. No, I mean, go for it.
Go. No, I was going to say,
No,
the rule is you're going to go.
No.
I refuse.
I was just going to chime in saying, like, to your point, Howard, that seems to be a reflection of U.S. machismo and a reinforcement of it. This idea of like you're hitting people if they hit a home run and then they toss their bat too high and you don't like it. That seems to me to be like a reflection of that part of our society. I'm not saying that doesn't exist anywhere else, but and then when you start to see it creep in and question. Now the topic is should we still be beating people in the head?
Right.
And there's almost this digging in of the heels.
Itself, Kate.
Yeah, we're digging in of the heels. Is like this is what makes men is being able to do this.
Well, that sounds like hockey as well. Like, for example, I remember taking a girlfriend when I was living in California, and I took her to a Sharks game. And in fact, I got to see Gretzky playing for the Rangers. And fight breaks out, and she's going, "They're fighting." Yes, they're fighting. And nobody's doing anything about it. I'm like, they're not. How can that be? I'm like, those are the rules. And once again, fighting in hockey is one of those things where if you're not a hockey person or not a sports person at all, and you just happen to like walk past the TV and you see all these guys duking it out and both benches are tapping their sticks going, "Yeah, good job, man, good job." What is this?
And then from a non-hockey person, like if they fall off their skates, it's over. Like that's the rule, right? Like who instituted that being the rule? That like that's
now they
the end
climb
of
on
the
top of
fight.
each other, but once there's a little bit of separation, like the referee, the linesman, they're waiting for a moment to jump in. But generally speaking, there's an actual rule to this. Like there is a structure to it. Like there is, like if you drop the gloves and I don't, you're not supposed to punch me. We're both supposed to, there's an etiquette to this. We're
Right.
both supposed to drop them at the same time. And then we're supposed to duke it out. And then there had been like this argument, very, not that different, very similar to baseball in terms of, okay, if you get a little too fresh, I'm going to throw the ball at you because this is how the game is allowed to police itself, right? That there's a structure.
Well, here's the funny thing about that. In both of those examples, both baseball and hockey, these are two sports where we can say unequivocally the best professional league in all of the world is right here in the United States. But if I said, who's the best at playing this sport? We wouldn't say the United States for either of those sports.
And never
Further,
have.
yeah, and furthermore, never have, and furthermore, beyond that, even now when they compete in world games like the World Cup of baseball, like the Winter Olympics in hockey, we don't have any of those shenanigans. We don't have the unwritten
right.
rule of hitting people because they bat flip. We don't have a bunch of fights in Olympic hockey. So, like, where does this air of superiority come where it's like, no, this is how it's done when clearly it's not done like this anywhere else?
And especially because I'm a big hockey fan. I love Olympic hockey. No fights at all. Still
Yeah.
a great game. Still a well-policed
Not,
game.
not still a great game.
It is a great game.
It's like when you say still a great game, it has a level of like whoa.
How can
they're
this
playing
be? How can
fun.
this be a good game because we don't do it?
Nobody got punched. How can you call this a good game? Right? It's crazy. It's like actually watching people play the sport that we came here to watch them do is actually a better product than watching them fight or throw things at each other or whatever.
Well, that's the old thing. I went to a fight and a hockey game broke out.
Yeah. Oh man. So yeah, but it goes back to kind of the rules, who's making the rules, who's upholding the rules. Why who if the rules were made a long time ago, why do we feel an attachment to making sure they stay the same? I always talk about this with basketball. We're the baby sport, right? So for us, changing rules is a part of the thing. We do it all the time. We have a competition committee that sits around and says, I don't like this rule. Let's try doing this instead. That's not the case in baseball. What is it about baseball specifically that makes it so resistant to change?
History. The game's been around since the end of the Civil War. And it's been played a certain way, even though during that time period in 1889, it was 8 balls to a walk, right? And then it went from 7 to 6 to 5, and ultimately they settled on 4. So all of those
polygamy.
Things, right?
Creeping down.
Exactly, right. It's a good compromise, and you start to have these, things become cultural. Like, and it would be really interesting to look and find out at what year the rules stopped shifting and it became the game that we know now. And I mean, as much as I agree with you that football is the baby sport. I'm sorry, that basketball is the baby sport. Football is the one that changes the rules all the time. I mean, if you like, the reason why people love baseball so much is the continuity that it's basically the same game, dead ball era notwithstanding, basically the same game for the last 100 years, right? The bases haven't changed. The game hasn't changed. The way the game is played, most of that stuff hasn't really changed. I mean, you emphasize other things, some things over others, but basically it's the same sport. Football, you can't tell by the decade. You change the pass interference rules, and all of a sudden, Matthew Stafford is throwing 2,000 yards a year more than Joe Montana, right? And this is all simply structure-based. It's all just rules.
Yeah. Well, it seems in that way that football has always been, I don't know, purposefully onto something, because you could, and probably people smarter than me probably already have made a case that football has reflected America throughout the decades in the way that it's being played. Like, no one would want to watch football now back in the 1920s when it was like, just rush the ball and there's no forward pass, and like it's basically
1970s.
rugby.
Exactly.
Or 1970s. And yet, you see like, as the ball is getting aired out, and then the proliferation of like the passers, like it feels very representative of American society too.
It's modern, right? And that's the and that's the thing. But very little of that has anything to do with fairness as much as it has to do with excitement. It has to do with
television.
And television.
Football is a television sport, and none of these changes have anything to do with, is this fair? and it has everything to do with how do we make this a better television product.
Exactly.
It's amazing.
You mean to tell me, you're not interested in the old Chuck Knox 3rd and 9 draw play? Right? It was essentially, you had run the ball, draw play, kick, punt. It was like the worst type of football ever. I was actually, switching gears a little quickly on this too, is that I remember bringing up my radical idea that basketball had outgrown itself, that basketball had outgrown its rules. If you go back to the founding fathers, to down the street in Springfield, nobody had ever anticipated basketball being as fast, as physical, as vertical as it became. And I was thinking, like, name me another sport where you get disqualified for a routine infraction. That would be like losing your left tackle because you got called for holding 3 times. It's like, this just needs to change. And especially because of the star system. You knew that in the last 6 or 7 minutes of a game, Magic Johnson and LeBron and these guys, they're not going to get called for fouls. They can do whatever they want. And so I was like, maybe there's another way. And I remember being on in the green room at Sports Reporters, and Ryan and Lupica and the late, great John Saunders, they laughed at me like it was impossible to change this. And yet, none of them actually argued with my point.
Right.
Which was, you can't officiate this game anymore.
And if it goes back to this idea that we've been touching on this whole conversation, which is that there's a reason that fouls existed in the first place, right? So Naismith is charged to come up with an indoor game to run off the boys' energy during the winter season. And then he's clearly that they are leaning toward being more physical than less physical because they're used to playing football outside. So of course, we've got to have these things called fouls. And in an added layer of punishment, let's make sure that there's a maximum number you reach and then you can't play anymore. And for that time period, right, I can't say for certain, but maybe that makes sense. Maybe it makes sense.
The non-contact sport.
Yeah, to your point, Howard, of like both the evolution of the game and the human body and society leads us to this place where, does that make any sense for the way we are playing the game now? In addition, something we've talked about offline being, does it make sense the actual physical parameters of a court now with the human
They're too big
body? Like they can barely hit a corner 3 without stepping out of bounds. I mean, it's like what rules should be immutable, to use Howard's word, and which ones should we be flexible on?
So it's funny because the dimensions of the court, even think about the 3-point line. Why is the 3-point line 23-9 up top and then 22 in the corner? It's not because of any weird math or anything. It's a very simple reason. The court's not wide enough to go 23-9 all the way around. That's why. That's the only reason why. So it's like, well, can we make the court wider? No, heaven forbid. It's funny. I always think about when people reject ideas like yours, Howard, of like, let's change the personal foul limit. Like, what were those people would have been like 50 years ago, 60 years ago, when someone said, guys, we just had a game that ended 1917. This is ridiculous. What if we put a clock right there and it's got like 24 seconds and they got to shoot or else?
So,
I
was watching the Australian Open last night, and Pam Shriver made a reference to the four corners defense. And I was like, I wonder how many people today know what the four corners defense is.
Yeah. No, it's but which was basically, for those of you guys don't know, it's four corners is like, hey, we're up.
Keep away.
Yeah,
just away for 10 minutes.
Hold it and pass it, and the guys are in 4 different corners in the front court. But so it's always funny to me when people say absolutely not, that's how we've always done it. It's like, you don't understand how many ridiculous, radical rule changes there have been throughout the course of basketball and other sports. For instance, you used to be able to shoot a free throw for as long as you took off from before the free throw line. It didn't matter where you landed. It was all right. You know why they changed that rule? Because Wilt would just run up and dunk from the free throw line. And they're like, okay, we've got to stop that. Right. So there's all types of things that we change because we realized this doesn't work anymore. With regards to your idea about the fouls, Howard, I think one of the reasons why foul outs exist is because not just because it was a very physical sport once upon a time, Kate, but also we have to make it so that the defense that you play can't be just, well, I'll just foul them.
I'll just
Because
crush you, exactly.
yeah,
And that was Ryan's point.
But
Ryan was like,
the-
well, you're going to have guys crush each other every 2 minutes.
well, even if
yeah,
it's
but I
not
mean, or
crushing-
isn't the penalty already baked into the with the 1-and-1 and two shots? I mean, there's that disincentive to not be fouling.
Sure,
That's
sure.
right.
But the problem is, okay, for players, let's say for against a Shaquille O'Neal or a Giannis Antetokounmpo or whatever, I'll take that disincentive. I'll let him shoot. And you tell me I can play my guy the whole game. He doesn't have to leave. That's a problem. I had this conversation with Ethan Strauss a long time ago. Ethan said free throws are the most boring part of any NBA game. So why don't we just get rid of them? Why don't we just get rid of them? Why don't if the guy gets fouled in the act of shooting, just give him the 2 points? And I said, you think that's going to get rid of guys hunting for free throws? So like the opposite. You're gonna get even a more elevated version of people hunting for things. So I want to, like, I guess all this part of the conversation is all about the best intentions of mice and men, right? Like, you know, we want this to be a nice fluid game, but the reality is some of these rules are in place not because anyone likes it, but because the alternative is for people to act
Well, but let's go
chaotically.
back. But let's go back to this, right? Let's stay with the NBA. My rationale when we were having this conversation was all about the star system. Was about the referees are caught in a political situation. That's Julius Erving. That's Damian Lillard. That's Magic Johnson. I can call a foul on Marcus Smart, but I'm not calling that very same foul on LeBron James, especially in the final 5 minutes of a game. Right? So my issue wasn't simply that, okay, the game has been outstripped by its rules. I'm sorry, the rules have been outstripped by the game, but also that you've got a major problem here because you can't even call the game the way it is.
Howard, not a problem, because nobody at home is watching and say, ooh, I wish Marcus Smart could play a little bit more. But if Damian Lillard fouls out, if LeBron James fouls out, if Magic fouls out, now we have a television problem. Now we have a product problem. And the star system exists because that's what puts bacon on the table.
So we're not even talking at all about
Not
the
fairness.
actual product of the
Look at
fairness
us,
of the game.
even we're falling into the default fairness trap, right?
That's
Which
right.
is this could be more fair, and Amin is here to tell us. Sure, it could be more fair, but does it impact the product? Does it impact the bottom line?
Well, it goes back to, once again, the reason for the rules is constantly moving. Like for example, like when you're talking about the product in the NFL, and we're talking about fairness, and we're talking about opportunity and all of these things. Talk to a defensive player over the course of the last 30 years in the NFL. They're like, you don't even want us to play. You don't want us to be part of. We're only on the field because we have to be, right? I mean, you look at right exactly. So if you're a defensive player, everything in your universe has been to lessen your impact on the sport. And what's been really funny about it is that you go back to the Chiefs and the Bills game, people were complaining, where's the defense? You took the defense away years ago.
You can't touch anybody. You can't
touch anybody.
I mean, it's so, and by the way, if you hit a guy too hard or in the wrong place or at the wrong time, all of these carry massive penalties with them. And, you know, the reality is, and I'm interested to see how the NFL adjusts, because I think we saw a little bit of that this year in the NBA, where there happened a reinterpretation of some rules, because we began to realize that the offense had too much of an advantage. And part of a beautiful package or a beautiful television product is seeing the offense overcome some sort of resistance. But if we lessen the impact of defense in the sport, at some point there is no resistance,
But
and
your
it's
game's
just
out of balance.
yeah. Now we're
and
just
this is it's kind of like the rules, rather than being like immutable and fair, are basically trying to hit some level of a sweet spot, right? It's all about the sweet spots. Like, where is the product the best? Where we're getting the most money for the TV product. People feel like there's defense, but it's not limiting us to 9 to 7 games.
Right.
And I feel like that, and that's kind of the conversation we were having too on the NBA side, being part of what's baked into the game about having 5 fouls and fouling out, or 6 in the NBA, is like, it's a strategy play. It's
Right.
it's baked into the strategy. So if you remove it, how does it affect the strategy? And like,
Penalty
is there a
box in
sweet
basketball.
spot there? Yeah. All right, Howard's got another one for us.
Penalty box in basketball. Or you know what? Or how about that? You know what? You are going to be disincentivized to foul if you got 2 shots in the ball or 1 shot in the ball.
Right.
Right. I mean, there are ways to do this. Right. There are ways to do it.
Yes,
They
to
did
hit
it in
that sweet
summer
spot.
league. They did it in
Mhm.
summer league a few years ago, where rather than have guys foul out, you were allowed up to 10 fouls, but every foul after your 6th one, it was like 1 shot in the ball for every foul that you had, that you committed. So it was kind of a different kind of disincentive structure. This gets me curious as to, for you guys, if you could change any rule in any sport, what would it be?
I mean, for me,
you just
it
need
would
time.
definitely,
Go ahead,
you would
Kate.
need, I mean, for me, it's always been basketball, because I feel like the NBA game is actually a fraction of what not a fraction. It's a large percentage of the possibility of what it could be. I mean, there's so much, like the way the game was invented, because we've talked a lot about, Naismith and the original playing of it. There was so much beautiful movement. And not that we've lost that completely. It's been, the movement has been like shifted to the outside more than like backdoor cuts. If you could combine the insane athleticism with movement and open up the court, like to me, that has long been, since I covered the Sixers, and you're sitting courtside and you're actually seeing up close, as I know we all have, how big those players are and how small that court is, and the potential for what basketball could look like. It feels like it's a no-brainer in the next 20 years to like expand that.
All right, I'm going to start yelling at the clouds right now. And I don't care if anybody's mad at me for yelling at them, because they're my clouds, okay? I would get rid of the 3-point shot. And the reason why I would hear me out. I haven't even started yet. Here's why I would get rid of it. Here's the reason why, right? I grew up with basketball as a game of makes. Very simple. If you were a good offensive player, you made half your shots and you made 80% of your free throws, right? I mean, that was a good offensive player. Like, even if you go back, and I'm an 80s guy, so I'm not a 90s guy, so I'm not used to looking at, John Starks and shooting 40% from the field. Sorry, Chris Herring. But and also Kate Fagan 3. Sorry about that, John Starks.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, John Starks is my guy. He's my childhood basketball hero. So thank you, Howard, for the name check there.
Right, I am absolutely into the 80s. I mean, Doug Moe went a little too far with the 126 a game while giving up 125 with the 81-82 Nuggets. But at the same time, basketball has now turned into a game of misses. And I don't watch the game for misses. I watch the games for high efficiency makes. And the way that this game is now, when you're going 9 for 27 from 3, and that the word efficiency now is it's not based on making shots. It's based on the amount of threes that you have the amount of twos you have to make to compensate for the extra point. But what's being lost in here is the aesthetic of, we're just watching so many goddamn misses. They're just clanking the ball up and down. So I'm like, okay. I also remember the late 90s and the Celtics and the Knicks and the Pistons beating the hell out of each other and clogging the lane to the point where the game bogged down there, which brought us into the 90s. So somewhere along the line, I wonder what that compromise could be, because that game brought us into the 90s Knicks and Pacers scoring 140 points combined. But what we have today is, it's a 3-point shooting contest. And so somewhere I'm trying to find out what that balance is going to be. With the way these guys can shoot today, with the size and the fact that positions don't even exist anymore, not having your entire offense tied to a 1-4 high, everybody shoot the 3, or circle, ring the 3-point line, maybe you'd have a lot more mid-range, maybe you'd have a lot more space, maybe you'd get better shooting. I don't know.
And before we go to you, is it possible that opening up the court is a partial sell for what Howard's talking about? Because there's some disincentive to the mid-range game, because so crowded everywhere you move on the floor. Like there's more space the farther out you get.
Yeah, I disagree with Howard, but and I
You can
realize
and you
I
can
did
do
I did
that. Go.
I
Let me
did that.
have
He
it.
Yeah.
said he was
No,
yelling
it's
at the
funny.
clouds.
No, I know, and it's funny. It's like, hey, if you could do anything, what would it be? And then I immediately want to say, I want to be one of those people. You're nuts, Howard Bryant. What are you
Do it.
talking about? No,
But it is a game of misses now, right? I mean, tell me,
it-
do you?
it's this is what the game is built on, and I think two things have happened. One is the players are, as we said earlier, bigger, faster, stronger, more athletic. They cover ground in a way they didn't even.
Yeah,
30
their
years ago.
length, absolutely.
That's one part of it. The other part of it, as I think, defenses and particularly defensive strategies have advanced massively because what happened in the 90s was as the money came in from the TV deals, teams that in the 80s used to have 2 assistant coaches now have 4 and 5, right? And you've got guys who their whole job is I'm just watching these 3 teams, what offenses they're running on a nightly basis, what are the play calls they're doing, what are the play calls called, where do they like, and so the preparation levels of NBA teams today through technology, through just a bigger budget, is so much larger than it was even in the 1980s. That, yeah, like it's so hard for our star players to do what they do because the defenses are so too good. So you got to have something, some sort of disincentive to pull away. Because if you take away that line, and it's a difference between me watching, say, for instance, Joel Embiid dunk it or Seth Curry attempt a mid-range jumper, I'm going to, like, they're both 2 points, but one of them has a much higher likelihood. So I'm going to do everything in my power to not let this one happen.
But isn't that what's happening now?
But the difference is the threat that happens with a Seth Curry or whoever is that when he hits his shot, he gets an extra point on top of that. So
Yeah.
now I have to do a very real calculus of, okay, what's worse, a short thing right there or a kind of short thing over there, but that carries a larger
Not even
value
close
on
to
it.
a sure thing. I mean, what? I mean, nobody shoot 36, 37% from
So-
3. What's Steph shooting from 3 now?
So let me stick with Seth because it illustrates like the either or the pick your poison. Seth Curry shoots 41.7 from 3, right? But if you were to take that and pull his effective field goal percentage on those shots, that's basically taking his makes and realizing that instead of counting for 2 points to count for a point and a half above that, overall his effective field goal percentage is at 60%. That's with his 2-point makes as well. So it really is a much higher proposition of, like this is, it's when you add that extra point in, it's a lot closer to one another, the Embiid dunk or the Seth Curry 3. Now the problem is not everyone's Seth Curry.
I was going to say, what happens when you start adding everybody else to this? What happens to the aesthetic of the sport? And I remember talking to Tom Thibodeau about this when he was working for ESPN. We're in the green room one day, and I'm like, Tibbs, what is happening with this sport? He goes, well, the analytics of the sport say that there are only 2 shots you're trying to get. You're trying to get a dunk and a corner 3. That's what we're trying to get on pretty much every trip down court. Those are the open shots based on where the defenses are.
And that's what I would, yes, but also that's what based on what the defense is giving you. A lot of times that's what happens, but I would disagree with Tibbs in this way. To me, the 3-point shot is not about being a 3-pointer for the sake of being a 3-pointer. The 3-point shot is about how do I make defenses respect the other non-stars on the floor enough to let my stars do what they do, whether it's a 3-pointer, a mid-range shot, or in the paint. I want my LeBrons, my Kevin Durant's, those guys to be unfettered by this guy's hanging out like, hey, I'm not really guarding my man, so I guess I would help out over here. To me, and this leads me to my proposed rule change, and I stole this from someone. I don't remember who it was. I think it's Tom Havistro.
It's not even your rule change, then, if you
Not even my rule change. I like the idea that every home team gets to set where the 3-point line is. I love this idea because if you're Milwaukee, you could say, hey, when you come to Fiserv, the 3-point line is the restricted
So you
area.
want to go old-time hockey baseball where every arena has different dimensions.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, because I want teams
Width of court as well?
I mean, no. Well, maybe, I don't know. Let's throw it up there. Yeah, why am I fighting that? Yeah, sure, why not? But the whole idea is I kind of, in a weird way, admire baseball and the fact that all the stadiums are different, all the fields are different, and as a result, the front office calculus and how we build our roster takes that into account in the way
That's
that
right.
in other sports we're just putting the best 26 man, 53 man, 15 man roster we can. So I like the idea, like, no, there's a little added level of strategy here. Like, oh, if I've got a guy like Giannis who is unstoppable and has high volume right here, why wouldn't I want to exploit that versus if I'm a team like, say, the Golden State Warriors, where I shoot a lot of threes, I don't have a lot of inside might. I want that 3-point line as far out as possible to make sure that the other team can't keep up with what we can do in both volume and accuracy from that distance.
That is outstanding. You know what? I am very, very happy that you ridiculed
And then
my
introduce that
short-sighted
one.
exactly
Yes.
with my short-sighted vision, and you introduced that because that would be amazingly fun, and it would also go ahead, Kate.
No, go.
I was going to say,
I got something.
what it would also do is it would radically change rosters. The only thing that I would suggest is our basketball players that diverse that you would have really different rosters, right? Like when you're looking at the 87 Twins or the 82 Cardinals playing on AstroTurf, those teams, those players, you had to get different types of players. Whereas if you were playing at Wrigley Field, if you were the Cubs or the Red Sox or the Orioles, you were looking at boppers because you had a short fence and those guys couldn't run, they didn't steal bases, they were just trying to hit the ball over the fence because they were playing to their ballpark.
I submit to you that the players are whatever the rules say they are. Just like 20 years ago, we didn't have anybody big really shoot. There was a couple of outliers like Sam Perkins and guys like that shooting threes. But once we started saying this is important, what do? You get a generation of 7-footers that all play out there. They'll do whatever we tell them is important to do. That's why we have so many players who want to be 3-point shooters.
Okay, let's switch gears. I'm sorry, Kate, you got one more?
I was gonna say, like, I think we've landed at like a larger theme here once again, being that like the rules seem to reflect society and reinforce it. Because I mean, you could make an argument that the death of the mid range is also correlated with like the death of the middle class in America. Like this idea of
All or
3-pointers, or all or nothing. The stratification, the polarization of the U.S. seems to also be reflected in the way our sports have played out.
Yeah,
baseball too. Baseball too.
Baseball,
right?
same thing, and that's why they're not playing right now. Let's finish our last 15 or so with the NFL. Let's go to this specifically. This is what started this whole conversation, and we haven't really even talked about it. When we talk about fairness and we talk about intention, the purpose of the overtime rule, to my mind, had always been, at least ostensibly, that both teams would get a chance to touch the football. That the reason why you brought in this overtime rule was because losing on a first possession field goal was kind of trash, right? And that you're creating this half measure that, okay, the argument that people are saying against this overtime rule with both teams touching the ball or whatever is get a stop, right? How many times have we heard this? Well, stop the ball, get a stop, and we're not talking about overtime. Buffalo, you had, you had 13 seconds to kill and you were on your own 25-yard line. That is all well and good, but that's not discussing the actual rule that we're talking about, right? So the rule itself is a half measure. On the one hand, it kind of sucks to lose on a first possession field goal. But on the other hand, we don't want defense to mean nothing. So yes, if you give up a touchdown, then that's on you, which doesn't really answer the fairness question of should I have a chance to touch the football? Now, to Kate's point of maybe none of this really works well, what do you do if you get the ball on the 25-yard line and you have a 12-play, 14-minute drive? The other team's not getting the ball anyway, right? So
why is there a clock? Someone asked that the other day.
I asked, why is there a clock in overtime, right? So my question is, what is the goal here when you're thinking about this game, when you're watching this game specifically? To me, I felt like, all right, if you're going to have a rule that says that's designed for both teams to touch the ball, then both teams should get the ball. That's it, right? Whether you score a touchdown, whether you score a field goal, what the NFL seems to be doing in this overtime rule is to say one score, one type of score is more legitimate than another type of score. A touchdown is a definitive game ender, but a field goal really isn't, and that's what leaves me cold.
Yeah, it seems like the NFL is doing everything it can to not find itself in a situation that soccer has always found itself. Like they don't want an end of game that is like, all right, let's just kick best of 5 field goals here. They can't have that. And then at the same time, it seems to me that there is this feeling of football is very difficult and we can't just play it forever. So we want to put certain parameters in place to get to a resolution before we're just like little tackling dummies out there and we don't even feel like we have our best product anyway. And it feels like they're trying to thread the needle on something to the point in the beginning where I don't know that you're ever going to be able to thread it.
Right. I love the evolution of what overtime rules were and how we got here. We got here because people were, as Howard said, because people were winning a coin toss.
Yep.
They won a coin flip, and that's how they won it, right? And before that, we got there because people were playing 7 million overtimes, right? The overtime would just never end because teams were getting stop after stop or whatever. The other part of this that's funny is you don't want to be soccer, but you know who else they don't want to be? College football.
They don't want to be college football.
There is such a weird dynamic between pro and college sports. There's a symbiosis of we need each other, and then there's also this, oh, I don't do it like that. That's how they do it over there. And so the idea that in college football, hey, each team gets a possession or whatever it is, and you get a try
from the 25-yard line,
and you just keep going.
You score a touchdown, cool. Now it's your turn. If we want to stop you or whatever, then that's it. That seems to me like a pretty good system, right?
But since they already have it, it's off the table, and that's a weird place for the NFL to be.
That's how they do it over there. We'll never do it over here, right? And that's the needle you're talking about threading. There's a second needle that you have to also thread, which is also has to be something that they're not doing over there.
So that's just your ego. That's just ego talking.
Yep.
Well, isn't that what all of this is about? It's
always the way it is.
All the rules are about ego on some level, right? The idea like, no, we're not going to do it like that because A, we've always done it this way. That's ego. Or B, because that's how they do it over there. We don't respect them.
That's right. But to the get a stop people, giving up a field goal isn't getting a stop either.
Yeah.
So that doesn't quite answer it. And I just sort of feel like when you're looking at the intention of this overtime rule, I think you're right, Kate. I think when it comes to football, because you can hold the ball, it's not like baseball where, okay, you get your 3 outs at the top of the 10th and I get my 3 outs at the bottom of the 10th, because it's not based on outs, it's based on time. So what you would have to do if you were going to do it this way in the NFL was you couldn't have a clock. You get your possession, whether it's 10 plays, 10 minutes, or whether it's 3 plays, 2 minutes, and then I get my turn. And then we go from there. That you actually have an untimed overtime if that's how you really want to do it. If your goal is fairness.
I can't believe we've gone this far and I forgot about the most important rule change of all time, where Stugotz says, in baseball, we should have 1 extra inning, and if after 10 innings we don't have a winner, home run derby.
Home run
Soccer
derby.
style shooter, yeah. And you know what?
I just like Roy Wood Jr., who just says, fight. Fight. If we're tied at the end, fight.
Enough of this bullshit.
Exactly.
Let's just
exactly. No, that's right. And I think that's one of the things that I really enjoy about this conversation is the ability to look at the reason for the things, right? We like to rely on this idea that, no, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to create the most fair and equitable outcome for all parties involved. No, you're not. No, you're not.
No, that might be like number 9 on the list.
Exactly. And that's
a byproduct. If it happens, that's a great little byproduct, but not the driving force.
No, not the driving force. And that's why I tell people when we talk about sports and they talk about what you do for a living, and I always tell them, I hate to break it to you, but winning is probably 4th on the list for most teams. It's really not first. It's not first for, Cost control is pretty much first. Player control is second. The third thing is more than likely making sure you have stadium control. And then fourth is let's put a pretty good product on the field. I mean, the business of the game comes before the game. And people they look crestfallen when I say that, but hey.
You know what you just did there to them? You pulled the curtain back too quickly.
Mhm.
You can't show them
And do
everything.
that slower. Yeah.
Exactly.
Blows their mind.
Exactly. It's like telling them Santa Claus is the old guy who lives around the corner that you just don't see all the time.
Mm.
Yeah. Final thoughts, anybody?
Oof. Kate, you can't widen the court for one reason and one reason only. That means you took a row of the highest dollar amount seating out of every arena, and they will never go for that. And I know people say, wait a second, a bigger court means you have more courtside seating, so that new first row gets to be the one that's most expensive. But the reality is you're still taking out whatever the attendance is, you just took out a sliver of money there. And so if anything, they're trying to figure out how to pack more people in these places.
Wait, so you think in like 80 years, when human beings have evolved even further, we're still going to be watching basketball if we're still around. If we're still going to be watching basketball on these parameters court, this parameter of court.
So the evolution of basketball is going to happen this way with the court dimensions change. About 10 years ago, the Bakersfield Jam, which is a G League franchise, they're defunct now. They got the idea. They played in Bakersfield, which is the middle of nowhere. So, we've got this 10,000 seat Civic Center. We can't fill it up. We're not doing well financially. So what they got the idea to do is they got rid of the Civic Center. They played in the practice facility. What they did was they made luxury boxes. It was a 100% capacity luxury box deal. There was only about like 500 seats. But they got to charge an arm and a leg because it was like a kind of a luxury experience, right? A high-end experience. I think that's the next evolution of sports, that the in-person crowd is going to be a lot smaller and it's going to cost a lot more money. And when you do it like that, then you can start having fun with how big the court is.
Whew. So we're getting even more polarized. We're going even farther down that.
What
Yeah.
Gordon Gekko say? Greed is good.
Greed is the essence. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I actually think that if you take the last two conversations that we've had about jobs and about fairness and equity, and you add it to this one as well, you really do get a sort of idea of how these businesses work and about whether or not where the priorities are and how these priorities are how we list our priorities and what we tend to care about. It will be very, very interesting to see over time the reason for the upcoming rule changes. And I've always referred to football as the Chinese food of American sports, right? You consume it. You can't stop consuming it, but it doesn't really stay with you the way baseball does historically and the rest of it. But in this game, and the way that the NFL deals with this, and I think that by the end of the season, we're going to see overtime rule changes. It's going to be interesting to see how they implement it and why.